Hi everyone, thank you for joining me today. My name is Lucrezia and I'm Senior Italian Language Manager here at Supertext. Today, I would like to warmly welcome you all to our second webinar, Interpreting Meets Translation, Strategies to Boost Productivity. Now, in case this is the first time you use Microsoft Teams live events, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the working process on this platform. First, you should see a pause button. Please do not click on the button, otherwise you will no longer be live. Second, on the top right corner of your taskbar, you should see an icon with a speech bubble and a question mark inside it. Please feel free to use this channel to post any question, input, suggestions, whatever you like during the presentation. And at the end, I will be more than happy to address everything since I plan a Q&A session. Please also feel free to write anything about technical problems. If you should experience a technical problem, my brilliant colleague Kevin from the IT staff will answer you immediately. Please also remember that this presentation is being recorded and that the majority of the examples will be mainly in English, but the presentation is relevant for all languages. I would like now to thank all the beautiful staff at Supertext who helped me putting together this presentation. So let's get started. Now, while I was preparing the presentation, I asked myself, okay, let's ask the freelancer about inputs. What would they like to learn? It was actually very interesting because many of you wrote something like, I would like to learn unknown interpreting skills. Or maybe I would like to learn skills to improve my liaison interpreting. Or I would like to learn how the brain of a simultaneous interpreter works. Now, before we start, let me put that straight. This presentation is not strictly about interpreting. But if you feel the need to talk about it, please email me at any time, and I will be more than happy to organize another webinar where we will talk a little bit more about interpreting, strictly speaking. Also, I would like to say to you that since many of you registered only yesterday, I wasn't actually able to integrate all the valuable inputs you wrote me. But since they're really, really good, I would like to spontaneously integrate them at the end, maybe just before the Q&A session. So please stay with me because we will talk about it as I promised. Now let's shift for a minute to the focus of this presentation. In this presentation, we will cover two main topics. We will see how some interpreting skills used as pillars of the interpreting profession can actually be very helpful while translating as well. We will take a look at sight translation and note-taking. These techniques used in interpreting are actually, as I said, the pillars of the profession, the foundation. Maybe you do understand why. Because they help you minding the gap, as the title of this slide says. They can help you speed up the whole translation process and the whole interpreting process. But please, bear in mind that during the presentation, I will give you inputs, practical exercises you can use in your daily business to speed up the process. But everything is about mental preparation, which means you have to exercise, you have to practice. Think, for example, about playing the piano. Actually, when you want to play the piano, you should start by the very beginning with scales. Or if you want to play volleyball, for example, you should start usually with a warm-up or by juggling balls. And this is exactly the same we would like to do in this presentation. We will see that it will take time before seeing tangible results, but it's extremely valuable, and I encourage you to try that. So my aim is, again, to give you practical exercises. Now, before we start, let me just briefly introduce the interpreting profession for those of you who are not so familiar with this job. The interpreting profession is usually divided into three main modes. simultaneous interpreting, consecutive interpreting, and liaison interpreting. Now, during simultaneous interpretation, the interpreter here listens to the talk, to the speaker. Usually he sits in a booth, in a separated booth, and renders the speech, as the name says, simultaneously. During consecutive interpreting, on the other hand, the interpreter simply hears, takes notes, and at the end, when the speaker is completely done with the speech, delivers. In liaison interpreting, finally, the interpreter is usually invited in a delegation, for example. This is a typology also known as bilateral interpreting, which means that the typical scenario is that the interpreter takes part in the delegation. He is invited to take part to the delegation, but only interprets when required. So he accompanies the whole people taking part into the delegation. Now, usually translation and interpreting are two very strictly separated fields. But there are actually some parallelism. While the translator may benefit from the mindset of an interpreter, the same applies to the interpreter. He can also benefit from the extremely focused mindset of a translator. But if you take a closer look at the interpreting profession, you will immediately see something very important. The interpreter is constantly forced to move away from the original text, from the original speech. He simply cannot translate word per word or structure per structure. So in this process, they need to keep distance, and they are specifically trained to avoid any kind of borrowing or literal translation. As I said at the beginning, they can do that by starting with two pillars. Let's take a look at them in a minute. But before we start, I would like to show you some screenshots, because you may actually think that only slogans and transcreation require you to move away from the original text, so to say, to keep distance. But it's actually not that case. Because while I was preparing this presentation, I took a look in Trados and I collected some examples that you can see here for different languages. In this slide, I will show you a couple of examples about the Italian language. And I'm sure that the Italian-speaking colleagues among us will maybe laugh when hearing or listening or reading to the third example. Now, as you can see here in the screenshots, the yellow part is not correct. The purple, on the other hand, is correct. So if you take a look at the third example, you will read something like, would you like to breathe fresh air? In German, the original text says, would you actually hear some news? So you can really see that this screenshot does not convey the meaning at all. But actually, the same applies to other languages as well. Take a look, for example, at the German. In the first one, it actually says, die Ladengeschäfte sind nicht tot, which means the shops are not dead. But you can say it in ways more elegant ways. You can actually say it in a much more elegant, polite form. And the same applies to other languages. For example, in French or in Russian. I'm sure that many of us already encountered examples like that. Maybe while doing a proofreading or simply translating. And if you take a closer look at all these examples, they can be really detrimental for the quality of the translation. But I also have examples for languages like Korean or Spanish or Portuguese. These screenshots all stick so much to the original text that they simply do not sound natural and fluent in the target language. Even if they are correct, for example, the Portuguese. A utilização que não esteja mencionada na etiqueta is actually correct, but it simply doesn't sound natural at all. It's much better to say a uso não conforme. And I'm sure you will agree with me. So, we are all translators. We studied at university, or we've been working in this industry for like 10, 15, 20 years. So I'm sure every single one of us knows which are the common mistakes and how to avoid them. Maybe when analyzing the original text, you will see identical word order or phrasing, sometimes identical verbs, idioms, and even identical punctuation in your target language. This happens, for example, when translating from German, because the German language uses a lot of commas. But you can't do the same in a language like Italian, Spanish, a Romance language. As I said, I'm sure that every one of us knows the solutions. For example, changing a word order, splitting a sentence, or rewriting, preserving the original intent of the text. Of course, by following the rules of punctuation. But still, if we actually know which mistake we made and how to avoid them, why do we keep on doing them? How can we try to avoid them in order to have much more fluent texts? Well, the screenshot I showed you before showed that it's actually not so easy. So let's take a look for just a moment to the translation process. This is actually how translators usually work. They start by reading the text and understanding the meaning. Then they have to move away from the original text, focusing only on their mother tongue. And then after they started writing, they usually take a break. And only after a pause, they start reviewing, refining, so fine-tuning the text. But there's a major problem here, exactly here. There's a pain point if you take a closer look at the translation process. Can you maybe understand what I'm talking about? It's detaching. By writing literal translation, we are not focusing on a mother tongue. We are still sticking so much to the original text that we have a text which doesn't sound natural at all. So let's shift to the interpreter mindset I talked to you about at the beginning. Now, I would like to start by providing you with a quotation, with a very famous quotation taken from Jean-François Rosin. He says that if you take a text and you give it to 10 translators, chances are very high that you will have 10 very brilliantly translated texts. But actually, if you read them, you will see that the words are not the same. Why? Because the translator and the interpreter needs to convey the idea. What they are translating, what they are rendering in the target language is the concept. So, translating a concept is what the interpreter does, and the translator as well. But how? Well, in the interpreting profession, as I said at the beginning, there are two pillars. And you can use them as a preparation for your translation as well. These kind of exercises are used by interpreters usually before starting with the profession. And they are sight translation and note-taking. We will take a look at both of them and we will put them into practice to see how they can help us in the translation process. Now, this is how sight translation usually works. For those of you who are not so familiar with this interpreting mode, I would like to give you an example. Sight translation is actually very used in the United States, in court interpreting, for example. It means that interpreters do not hear and listen to a text or to a speaker. They simply scan and read the text. They read it. And while they read it, they have to identify immediately the core meaning, the key points. At the same time, they have to bear in mind the décalage. What's the décalage? It's a French word. It means the necessary time to keep distance from the original text in order to fully understand the sentence while still reading. So it's allowed the interpreters to render the text in a faithful way, but without sticking to it. Because otherwise, it would probably sound like that. I will give you an example. Mr. Harman, would like Mr. Harman would like to complain. How was it? Oh, it would probably be something like that. So you hear it's painful to you to listen to. So during this process, interpreters need to identify the core meaning, the secondary sentences, and any kind of embedded sentences. At the same time, they have to control their own emotions and maintain the original intent of the text. And if you paraphrase everything, you will see that it's all about detaching, moving away from the original text. So there's actually a good news. You can do the same in translation too. Please do not rush. First, scan the text. When you start with a translation or with an exercise, please read it. Read the text. Don't start translating immediately. And most of all, please do not stick to single words. First, scan the whole text and then start typing. If you have a couple of technical words, please forget them at the beginning, because you will have time to go back to them at the end, or maybe during the whole translation process. But don't start focusing on them while you are reading the text and typing. Because if you do that, you will see that you are kind of wasting time for 20, 30 minutes searching for the meaning of a single word. And at the end, you will have no energy left for the whole text, which means you have to optimize your time because your time is precious. And at the end, when you have a draft, a first draft, you can go back and you can start fine-tuning. So identify the core message as an interpreter would do inside translation. Try to absorb the meaning and to convey the idea first, and then go back and start fine-tuning. And please, which is really important, leave the title at the end. When you start translating, don't start with the title, because you have actually no idea what's going to happen in your text. So the title is actually a summarization of the whole text, and you can go back to it after, when you're completely done. So let's put everything into practice. Please take a look at this text. This is a very good example because it shows you clearly that you have to move away from the original words. Now I will give you a couple of seconds just to read it, and then we will talk about it together. Now, can you actually understand why you have to move away from the original text and to absorb the meaning before starting to translate? You have here words like lager companies, swap out. If you start focusing on them before actually understanding what the text is about, you will simply waste your precious time. So what's the main message? You can actually try to identify it with 3 steps. These steps are usually pretty common in the interpreting profession, but they are also valuable for the translation profession as well. First, remember the piano. As I said at the beginning, if you want to become a true master in playing the piano, you have to learn the scales at the beginning. And this is exactly the same in translation as well. First, start by analyzing your text. Read the text, start looking for the core meaning, And if you wish, you can note down the main concept with a single word. Leave out any secondary point. Second, expand. Expand with different words. This simply means extensive reading, because through extensive reading, you should be able to find synonyms. For example, if a word has multiple meanings, and you would probably stick to the first one that comes to your mind while translating. And third, you can start altering the register, which means choosing the proper register, adapting it to your target audience. Now, if we go back to our text here, it's actually a very good example because we can try to apply these 3 steps to that. How would the text look like? How would it sound like? Probably like that, with 2 sentences. These 2 sentences encapsulate the whole meaning of the text. You have the first sentence and the second sentence. Both of them share a very important point, which is the famous SVO structure. Subject, verb, object. And from now on, once you identified the subject, the verb, and the object, you can start translating. You can start building your embedded and secondary sentences. In our example, it would probably be like, investors choose climate-friendly stocks for the first sentence. And now we have to link the concepts. So for the second sentence, it will be probably like, these stocks lower the carbon footprint. Now, of course, as I said at the beginning, you have to practice. Practice means exercising. So please bear in mind that you will need a bit of time. It will be a little bit hard at the beginning if you start sight translating, but you will see very valuable results over the time. At the beginning, as I said, you will probably find yourself sticking to single words. Remember the example about Mr. Hartman? It was like, oh God, he would like to, you see what I mean. And yes, it can be a little bit stressful at the beginning, but you will see brilliant results. Now, you might ask, how can I do that? Well, of course, you can take any printed article, maybe newspaper articles, or maybe just a book, and you could start sight translating into your mother tongue. But actually, you can do it the same using digital resources. So now I would like to talk about the teleprompter. Now, I don't know if somebody among you is familiar with the teleprompter, which is actually a machine showing the text in television programs or in theater. There are techniques and there are resources on the World Wide Web, and I would like to show 2 of them to you now. Let me share the screen with you. You should be able to see my screen in a moment. Now you should see the teleprompter. This one is called Q prompter. It simply means that you can copy-paste a text in this field, and then you can simply scroll down and click on Start Prompter. If you do that, it will probably be like that. Exactly like in theater and during television programs. Here you have your text, and if you click on forward, you will see that your text will start scrolling down. Let's do it together. It's like that. So you can actually start sight translating, identifying the core meaning of every single sentence. Of course, you might ask, okay, but it's way too slow. You can speed it up. For example, here, 4, or maybe here, 7. So that one is extremely fast, even for an experienced interpreter. I would suggest you, if you would like to try it, to start with 2, maybe 3, and then over the time, if you would like to try it on, with 4. But there is another one I would like to show you. Let me close that one and that one too. So this one is called teleprompteronline.com. I personally like it a lot because it's available in very different languages, as you can see here. I choose, of course, English for the audience, but you can find it in Italian, French, Chinese, and so on. And here you find a very comprehensive description of the program. For example, here you have the speed and the duration. You can see the symbols, what they mean. For example, play, pause, stop, and so on. And you can control your text size. So let's try it. I copy paste a fairy tale here, and if I click on prompt, it's exactly the same as for a Q prompter. Here on the grip button, you can start scrolling down the text. And again, you can adjust the speed, you can try it on for yourself, and maybe it will be really helpful for you during the time. Now let me close it and let me go back to my presentation. So there we are. You should see the presentation in a moment. All right. So as I said, you can start doing it with the teleprompter. But for those of you who actually like the sound of their voice, you can actually download Audacity. Audacity is a really good program used during the interpreting profession and during the interpreter training because it allows you to record yourself. And it's available for Windows, Mac, Linux. Of course, it's completely free. If you would like to try it, please pay specific attention to all the times you started using filling words or you started repeating yourself. Remember, Mr. Herman? Please try to avoid that. Pay specific attention to all those times you start saying, oh God, what's the word? You see what I mean. And now let's shift to the note-taking. Now, while I was preparing the presentation, I was sober. So this slide is not a mistake. These are actually my notes during university. They convey almost a minute of speech. And if you take a closer look at all of them, you can see that I use symbols, abbreviations, numbers. Consecutive interpreting is all about taking notes, but it's a work of memory as well, because the interpreter cannot simply rely on symbols, on numbers, and on abbreviation. If you take a look at this slide, you will see that actually it's definitely not shorthand, because I wrote symbols which are pretty difficult to understand. So in so doing, the interpreter can deliver the speech once the speaker is done, so it doesn't happen simultaneously. They have to memorize as much info as possible. And these symbols must be personalized, which means they must convey at the same time the idea of time, space, for example, future tenses, past tenses, and they have to use the SVO structure. Maybe you remember, with it, I mean subject, verb, object. So, as I said to you, they cannot rely only on symbols. I would like to show you this other famous quotation by Roderick Jones. He explains why they cannot rely on symbols, only on symbols. It's because otherwise they would pay so much attention to the single words and try to write them down or to draw them, that over time they will forget the connections between the words, the links. If interpreters focus on symbols rather than on the speaker and on the context, Over the time, they maybe not be able to recall what the key points are. And maybe they won't even be able to decipher what they wrote, maybe in a hurry, which means, again, detaching, moving away. So note-taking is usually working like that. The interpreter listens to the speaker. And then he has to identify the core meaning, and they can use memory aids. But the most important thing are the links, which means detaching again. The good news, you can do it the same in translation too. Moreover, you have an incredible asset at your advantage. Can you maybe understand what I'm talking about? It's time. You can read the text as many times as you want. And again, don't rush. Simply do not start translating as soon as you open Trados. Move away first. Move away from the original text, from the original words, and even from the original structure. Just focus on the core meaning, exactly as the interpreter would do. Let's put again everything into practice. Again, I have prepared a text here, and I will give you a couple of seconds to read it before talking about it together. Now, again, I'm asking you, can you understand why you need to move away from the original text and to focus first only on the core meaning and on your mother tongue? You have 9 lines here without a single full stop. The first full stop appears at the very end. So in many languages, sticking to the text and sticking to the same structure as in the original text would be extremely terrible. It would actually be detrimental. For example, consider languages like Japanese or Chinese. So again, let's try to shift to the interpreter mindset. How would an interpreter try to cope with this kind of problem? By preparing. Again, you can use these steps to prepare and to try to translate as well. First, break down the information, which means divide your text into smaller sentences. Start by focusing on the microstructure, and then, only then, on the microstructure, which means on the details. Please never forget the logical links between paragraphs. Second, you can start by condensing the core meaning into a word or a symbol or a number, just like in consecutive interpreting, just like in note-taking. And finally, rewrite using connectors, using links between the different paragraphs. Now, in our example, it will probably be something like that. Now you have 4 sentences. They are manageable. And here you can pretty easily see that the person understood the key points. And then you can start translating. Now, of course, if you remember the piano I was talking about at the beginning, you need to practice. You need to do it over time, and you need to refine your analytical skills. You can do it by, for example, using podcasts or audiobooks, or simply listening to a friend. Listening to a friend or a family member saying something for like 10 seconds. What can you do? You can start, for example, paraphrasing what they said. What was the core meaning? What did it say in these 10 seconds? You will notice that filtering the key points makes you quicker over time. You will be able to capture the core meaning by moving away from the original text. First, read, understand the text, and focus on your mother tongue, moving away completely from the original text, and then write. You can also try with the text analysis by reproducing it orally at the very end. First, you can start searching for the main information and then paraphrasing, rewriting. Identify the main topics and paraphrase everything with just few words or with just a single note. Exactly as in consecutive interpreting. Exactly as the interpreter would do when note-taking. Now let me recap. There actually are some interpreting techniques like sight translation and note-taking that can be very useful in translation too. First, they can help you avoid literal translations because you cannot and you should never focus on the original text and sticking so much to it by forgetting your mother tongue. They can help you be quicker and more spontaneous because they help you decide what's important. First, translate and then refine. You will spare time. Finally, they can help you gain self-confidence. Why? Because you must use your precious time in an intelligent way. You simply cannot spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes searching for the meaning of a single word before actually having read the whole text, before you know what the text is about. Try at the beginning to convey the idea and read the text later. And please practice extensive reading. So as I said at the beginning, don't forget the piano. Don't forget volleyball, jungling with balls, and doing a warm-up. Sight translation and note-taking are a preparation. They are a mental preparation in order for you to become more flexible while translating. And yes, you will need time, but you will have brilliant results at the end. Now, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I hope I could give you valuable inputs. And again, if you would like to have the slide, please email me at the end. And the same applies to the certificate of attendance. If you would like to have it, simply email me. Now, at the very beginning of this presentation, just before we started, I mentioned that some people wrote me a couple of more inputs, and they were really valuable. So I would like to address them just for a minute, just before we start with our Q&A session. And I'm very happy to read all the questions you published. But first, I would like to address these three questions. A freelancer wrote me that she would like to learn how to feel more motivated while using interpreting techniques. Now, first, I would like to say to you that these interpreting techniques can be a little bit hard at the beginning, but as I said, they are a mental preparation. If you see over the time that you become quicker, creative, you will, of course, feel better. And most important, please talk to your language managers because your language managers are there to give you feedback, guidance, and advice. Another freelancer wrote me he would like to translate more creatively and maintain high quality using interpreting techniques while the text is poor. The original text is very poor, so starting from a very poorly written text. Well, first, if you're stuck, please make a pause. Just take your time. Take time to reflect, to think, to calm down and to focus on yourself first. Second, I would also say to you, please start by considering your translation as a creative work. By creative, I really mean a narrative work, just as a narration. Because actually, while you are translating, you're not simply transferring the meaning. You are actually writing a story, a whole new world with its own life. Of course, I think that some courses online like Udemy or Coursera are really valuable. So would advise you to take to participate into those courses about creative writing, maybe. And then finally, another freelancer wrote me she would like to have some tips on how to survive during the lockdown. So the very first thing I would say to you, please watch the presentation, the webinar hosted by my colleague Francis Provine. You can find it on YouTube, searching for Supertext. And there you will see that Francis, my colleague, the head of the English team here at Supertext, talks about good vibes. So how to feel motivated, how to see everything in a better way, even in a crisis. So I don't have any points left, which means that now I'm very happy to open our Q&A session. So before we start, let me simply interrupt sharing my screen so you can see me better now. So I have 3 questions here. So a freelancer asked, what are the cons of applying interpreting techniques to the translation process? Okay, well, first of all, thank you. Yes, it's a very good question because you might think, you might argue that an interpreter is not so accurate as a translator. Because during the interpreting process, they are actually leaving out some information maybe, or unnecessary information, while at the same time still conveying the most important meaning and topic. So you could maybe think that the same applies to translation as well. But actually, if you take a closer look, simply because you're applying techniques, scaffolding techniques like tight translation or note-taking, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are not focusing on the main message. And it doesn't mean that you're lacking accuracy. So I have another question. So thank you for your webinar. It's really inspiring. But how do you cope with stress when side translating? That's again a good question. Well, first, I would like to tell you what I did when I was at university. I started doing improvisation theater. Now, you may laugh, but actually, despite COVID-19, I think it's a brilliant way to try to cope with stress. You might argue why we are talking about theater while still being focused on the interpreting and translation profession. It's because during improvisation theater, you have no script. You absolutely have no dialogue. You don't have the paper you can rely on. Instead, you are with a colleague on the stage, and you have absolutely no clue what's going to happen, what your colleague will say on the stage, which means during this whole process, you have to try to calm down, to at least reduce your stress level. Another thing I would like to say to you while you're experiencing stress is to try to avoid filling words like something like that. Because if you start to focus on that words before actually really understand what's going on in the interpreting conversation and in the translating conversation, you will easily stick to them so much that you will see, oh God, you're actually experiencing more stress than planned. So I have another question. How do you deal with specialist terminology glossaries when translating this way? Okay, if I'm not mistaken, I think you mean what I do while I translate if I encounter specialist terminology. Well, of course, I would always prepare in advance if I have an interpreting assignment. Interpreter usually prepare for weeks before an assignment if they know the topic and if they have time. And I would do the same in translation too. First, I will of course ask for more information, for more context, and then I will start to write lists, glossary lists with different words and the translation in the different languages. I would like to. I will always do an extensive research, but as I said at the beginning, my main point would be first to try to understand the whole text and to have a draft at least I can work on later, and only then I will start to focus on the specialist terminology. So I have another question. Just out of curiosity, can you go back to your symbols and explain them? What was the speech about? Yes, I can do it. Let me find the slide. Okay. Let me share my screen again with you. Okay, so you now see my notes again. Well, you should see my, okay, now you see it, perfect. Well, this symbol, for example, means I, it's the subject. It's very, it's the most important information while doing an interpretation consecutively, because you have to identify immediately the subject. And then you have here the verb. And in that case, the verb was graduate. And then I have here a symbol which represents for me industry. So the whole topic of industry, working for, I think that was about the metallic industry. And then here again, you have the object. Here I see, for example, my main topic. What was the topic about, you asked? It was actually a talk about a person wanted to see her family as a strategy and the strategy as a benefit for her family during work. So here you can see that every single topic is divided by a line, and then I start again with the subject, the verb, in which case, in that case, it was a question, and then with the object again. So, hi, can I work as an interpreter for Supertext? Who should I contact? Yes, you can work as an interpreter for us. I would say to you to try to contact the Chief Language Officer, Lucas Mayer, or your head language managers in your team. For example, Monica Grasso for the Italian team, and so on. You will find all the names on the internet. So I don't see questions left. So I would stop sharing my screen again. And yes, I would like to thank you. Thank you for your attention. I hope I could give you valuable input. And yes, if you would like to listen to another webinar about interpreting, feel free to email me at any time. And please stay safe and don't miss the following webinars that our colleague will host. Bye-bye. Stay safe.